Good morning, everyone. We're ready to begin. My name is Julie Landau, and I am a member of the Community Advisory Board for Genocide Awareness Week. And I am very, very pleased and happy to be here today to introduce this wonderful program that we'll be hearing from shortly. I just wanted to say briefly about my own personal experience with the subject of the Holocaust and teaching the Holocaust and trying to prevent genocide began about 20 years ago when I had the incredible opportunity to meet Gerda Weissman Klein, my dear friend. As you may or may not know, Gerda passed away this week, and I find it more significant for me personally to be attending this program and introducing our speaker today. If you haven't had a chance, or if you don't know Gerda Weissman Klein, I would urge you to read one of her books, All But My Life. Over the past 20 years that I've known Gerda and had many, many conversations with her and attended many events with her and heard her speak, I never got tired of hearing from her. Every time she spoke, there was some wisdom that came from her that had a deep personal impact on me. It's hard for me to accept that I won't be talking to Gerda anymore, and I won't be seeing her, and I won't be hearing from her. But her legacy will live on, and this conference becomes even more important to me because of that legacy. So I just wanted to say that if it wasn't for Gerda, I don't think I'd be here today introducing a speaker for a Genocide Awareness Week. She had such an impact on me, but also on anyone and everyone she met and anyone who read her writings or her book. And if you do know her or knew her, not only was her story of her Holocaust so compelling, what she went through, but her love of freedom and her love of this country. And she also always said to everyone that her most important possession was her US passport. So as you attend the conference this week, please keep Gerda in your thoughts, and please keep the lessons that she tried to impart to all of us in mind. And that's really why we're here today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Edward O'Donnell. Ambassador O'Donnell is a professor at ASU of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies, where he teaches courses on US foreign policy, human rights, lessons of the Holocaust, and lessons on preventing mass atrocities and genocide. Ambassador O'Donnell was a career US Foreign Service officer serving in Afghanistan, Germany, Austria, Colombia, Panama, and Paraguay, and has held other positions in the State Department in Washington. He has served as a negotiating ambassador in multilateral and bilateral diplomatic assignments, including Ambassador and Special Envoy for Holocaust issues and fighting anti-Semitism. He was also Charge d'Affaires, Deputy Chief of Mission, Consul General, Economic Counselor and Commercial Attache. He was also an executive assistant to 3 Under Secretaries and was an advisor on the Secretary's policy planning staff. He has worked in Kabul as a senior mentor advisor to the Afghan Minister of Counter Narcotics, and also as a State Department inspector in the Middle East Regional Office of the Inspector General, State Department. He's worked for the Bureau of Congressional Relations as acting principal deputy assistant secretary, and earlier ran the State Department liaison office to the House of Representatives. Please give me a warm welcome for Ambassador Edward O'Donnell.
Thank you very much, Julie, for that introduction. And I understand it's a beautiful spring day and where you are at Arizona State University. And so I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you in person. So this presentation about U.S. diplomacy in preventing genocide is from me personally as a practitioner, a U.S. diplomat in my experience. And I want to stress this is about preventing genocide, but other forms of atrocities and violations of human rights, whether it's mass atrocities or war crimes or ethnic cleansing or that ultimate tragedy of genocide. So this is one of my assignments as I was special envoy for Holocaust issues. And this was in Belgrade. I was visiting the Jewish cemetery there and laying a wreath on behalf of the US government, the people of the United States. With me is the head of the Jewish community in Belgrade, and also Ambassador Michael Polt, who during that period was very active in unresolved issues of the Holocaust and also bringing perpetrators to justice of the crimes during the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina and between the Serbs, Croats, and so on. My career was really every assignment was touched by the issue of human rights, and this is my second tour in Paraguay, and I just wanted to start off with an anecdote of what I did as a junior officer in terms of human rights. I was the most junior officer in the embassy in Paraguay. This was the dictator Alfredo Stroessner with President Jimmy Carter. Stroessner was an old-style Latin American dictator. He actually allowed a lot of people like Mengele and Nazis to reside in Paraguay and gave them passports. And he also was a human rights violator. He had about 1,000 people in jail who he said were communists. They weren't. They were in opposition to him politically. So the Carter administration had a very strong human rights policy to put pressure on people like Stroessner. And I met with families of those people who were in jail and who had been persecuted or killed. And so that was my job, to meet with them, let them know we cared. We knew that the world was watching the United States. I reported to the United States government agencies, State Department, about what was going on. And over that period of 2 years I was there, and actually 4 years during the Carter presidency, most of those 1,000 prisoners were released from jail. So I just wanted to pay tribute to that policy and tell you one anecdote of my involvement and also diplomacy and how it could make a difference. The commitment to human rights goes back to our founding as a country. It's a cornerstone of everything we're about as Americans. The right of individuals to live and the life to live is the most basic issue of human right, and democracy and individual freedoms. And of course, that is a part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we're a party to. And that certainly stated that preventing and responding to atrocities is a key national security and foreign policy priority. All of us in the State Department who work on these political economic issues believe that. And so there are two, I'm going to go through the bureaucracy a little bit, but I'm going to talk about people and how they were involved. People like myself, Foreign Service officers, other members of the US government in embassies overseas, and those in Washington. But I do want to set the stage and give you kind of a structure of how the US government's organized. So there are basically two ways we pursue human rights and try to prevent genocide and other forms of crimes against humanity. So one is grassroots. That's at the embassy level, contact with the countries and the people of those countries, which may be unstable. There may be ethnic conflict. And then strategic engagement from Washington. That's what you hear from Secretary Blinken and the president, of course, and senior leaders in Washington engaging at the strategic level. So it's really a whole of government approach. It's not just the State Department. There are a number of US agencies who I'll talk about in a minute who are involved. And of course, Congress has a very important role in passing legislation, authorization for the State Department to take action, sense of the Congress resolutions about tragedies unfolding, like currently there's bills now in Congress for Ethiopia, what's happening there, and of course war crimes in Ukraine as we speak. And they also appropriate the money, the funding, which is so important for our programs. Within the State Department, one of the key offices, certainly the policy office, is at the Assistant Secretary level, and that's the Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. Now, we actually have Ambassador Clinton Williamson, who's a professor in the ASU Law School. He was in his job as Ambassador at Large when I was Ambassador at Large for Holocaust issues, and he said that the U.S. country, quite correctly, is one of the only countries that has such a senior position that's focused on atrocity prevention. That was his job, and response and accountability as well for atrocity and crimes. And also the predecessor, Ambassador Mike Kozak, who was in that position up until just a couple of years ago. He also commented on how important it is that we train foreign service officers who go out to the grassroots in the embassies to be able to take a common sense approach to preventing atrocities so that they can hopefully take action before the conflict and the tensions become such a crisis. And so and we also have other former Ambassador at Large for David Sheffer, who teaches at ASU. He also held that, I think he was the first to hold that position. So you may think this is the art of diplomacy and what foreign service officers do, go to receptions and have meetings and high-level exchanges, multilateral diplomacy. Well, maybe in some parts of my career and career of other foreign service officers, you might get lucky and get to go to something like this, but this is probably more likely of how you're going to spend your time. This is a foreign service officer or a civil servant. We have both who are within the State Department, and she is with community leaders and women in a community near Lake Chad and Niger. And so she represents the Bureau of Conflict Stabilization Operations. That's the second organization within the State Department I want to talk about, and the people there that are working on that. And actually another ASU graduate, Rob Foucher, is the number 2 senior officer, principal deputy assistant secretary, and has been there for 2 or 3. He's got 2 degrees from ASU. So there's a number of representation in the Foreign Service from Arizona State University, from Arizona, from other universities in Arizona as well. So this bureau is really the implementer of the programs, whereas the Ambassador at Large is the policy office. And so their mandate is to strategic prevention, conflict resolution, security sector stabilization. Now, every one of the case studies I'm going to talk about in a minute of specific countries where they're at risk today, Ethiopia, I'm going to talk about, and Burma, the Rohingya issue. There are these officers involved going out, meeting with communities, trying to resolve it. And they're also in countries that are not in conflict, but maybe at risk, because we want to head off those conflicts that lead to violence or persecution of minorities. So the third bureau I'd like to talk about in the State Department is Democracy and Human Rights. Again, these are about 300 professionals, both civil service, foreign service, and they're the ones that manage the whole reporting effort that begins at the embassies. The embassy human rights reports first. That's an annual report to Congress, and it tells Congress what's happening in every country. Now, you can see these on the State Department website, state.gov. Go to human rights reports, and you can pick the country and read the most recent review from last year. And they're working on the one for this year to review 2021. So 2020, you can look at every one of these countries in terms of what the embassies were observing, what they were hearing from NGOs and non-governmental organizations, from also the victims or families of the victims. That all goes into these reports. This bureau also manages the International Religious Freedom Report, Trafficking in Persons Report. There are a number of reports about rights of individuals that are reported to Congress, and you can see those on the state website, country by country. So Stephen Gillen was in this bureau up until a year ago. He's also an ASU graduate, and Foreign Service officer, and he noted that when he was in that position, and he's still very active in another area, but personal contact with the on-the-ground non-governmental organizations like Human Rights First and Amnesty International, and then community leaders, security forces, and of course the governments, the bilateral relationship. That's how we find out what's going on and how we get information and how we engage and hopefully have a positive effect on stabilization and community, hopefully tranquility and without tension and that leads to violence. And then also David Kramer, who headed up one of the major NGOs, also headed up this bureau. He made the point about how we need to be close and to the people, and I think that's exactly right. So you can look at the human rights reports on the treatment of the Uyghur people by China, the Rohingya people, and so on today at the State Department website for more detailed information. The Department of Justice. Now, this is another government agency. I mentioned it's a whole of government approach. And so this is the second U.S. government agency that I want to talk about. And again, the people there are dedicated to our values of protecting human rights and to work hard against those violations of human rights or crimes against humanity. And you see their mission statement. I'll start with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That's the investigative arm. Embassies have a legal attaché who is a trained federal FBI agent who investigates crimes, certainly crimes involving U.S. citizens or who are murdered overseas or die overseas. They investigate that, but they also help the host countries investigate crimes. And by crimes, of course, I mean genocide, war crimes, and other types of crimes against humanity and violations of human rights. And then the prosecution, special prosecution section, they're the ones that bring the perpetrators to justice and where federal jurisdiction exists. And you may know of the Office of Special Investigations, which over the last decades under Director Ellie Rosenbaum has brought to justice a number of Nazis who resided in the United States. Klaus Barbie is one. And they entered the United States under false pretenses. They applied for an immigrant visa, didn't mention their role, whether it be as a guard in a concentration camp. But this is in this office, and Eli Rosenbaum got an award last year from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for making a difference of accountability and bringing the perpetrators for the Nazi war crimes and other crimes and other genocides more recently, bringing them to justice. The other U.S. government agency, obviously, that's involved overseas is Defense Department. And I spoke with my colleague at ASU in the ASU Lab for Leadership, Diplomacy, and National Security, Benjamin Freakley, and he helped me. And I was also in the U.S. Army, but he grouped it into three areas, which I thought made a lot of sense. That first, U.S. Army, U.S. military, generally all branches of services are represented in different areas of the world through the combatant commands. So in Southcom, you have a 4-star general, or EUCOM or PACOM, Pacific, Europe, et cetera. First is prevention deterrence. That's what the military attachés do in the embassies, but also the liaisons in Latin America, where I served, for example, Southern Command out of Miami was sending engineering units to Latin America, and they still do. They build roads and health clinics and dig wells, and that's all stability in the country and helps those countries to be prosperous. And so this is part of prevention that the DOD, the U.S. military, is involved in. When ordered by the commander-in-chief, they go in militarily, separate the combatants or warring factions, restore the peace, and then secure sites when they discover violence against civilians. And of course, as you probably know, under the law of war, the number one thing is to protect non-combatants. If you're and that, of course, is being violated now in the Ukraine by the Russian military. They are not adhering to the law of war and their responsibility to protect the non-combatants, the civilians. And then also the third stage is stabilization after a conflict, to try to bring, they downsize and they turn their areas over to diplomats or host nation authorities or the United Nations. And so that's their mandate and role overseas, working with the diplomats, State Department, and countless countries around the world. So this is the wiring diagram of the country team. The ambassador is the president's personal representative, and he reports to the Secretary of State. Now, he or she has a team of, could be a very large mission of over 1,000 people. Like when I was in Afghanistan, we had in the embassy well over 1,000 people, or it could be very small in some of the smaller countries where we have representation. But the human rights mandate of the embassy country team, the political section is where the human rights reports are written, but everybody has a role here. The regional security office protect the diplomats and U.S. citizens and other people. The defense attache I mentioned. Everyone here, starting with the ambassadors, committed to that human rights and preventing genocide, preventing atrocities mandate. So the top priority, U.S. citizens, and then that's the human rights reports, and then the official contact with the U.S. government, with the U.S. government between U.S. embassy and the host government. And then, like I told you about what I did in Paraguay, hearing the victim stories, finding out what's going on, talking to Amnesty First, other groups that are in the country, and they may be able to get into areas where diplomats cannot, because especially in conflict areas. Now, let's take an assessment. How have we done as diplomats in recent history? Well, the results are mixed, and I think anyone who's worked in this area, a career diplomat or civil service, will agree that we've missed opportunities to save lives. And so I think over the period we've tried to improve that process, and I think we've done a lot better, but I'll talk more about that. But let's look back. The Roosevelt administration, starting with that administration, certainly the Roosevelt administration led America to victory through World War II, and we defeated the Third Reich and Imperial Japan, and but because of the non-issuance of visas to Jewish families, that was a real problem during the 1930s. And there were bills in the U.S. Senate that for saving Jewish children that never went anywhere, 6,000 children, and hopefully could have been possibly saved. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has an exhibit as part of their permanent exhibit, has a lot of this information. President Roosevelt told one diplomat, a Polish diplomat, Jan Karski, who came to him and said, "Here's what's happening in the Warsaw Ghetto. People are dying. What do I tell them when I go back?" And he actually, Jan Karski had been in the Warsaw Ghetto, seen in person, and left and came to Washington. And so President Roosevelt told him, "Tell the people when you go back, we're going to rescue them through victory. We're going to win the war. That's how we're going to help them." So it's looking back with 2020 hindsight, it certainly, we missed opportunities to issue more visas to Jewish families so that they could be safe. In the 1990s Balkan Wars, I'll talk more about that. We were slow to respond to the ethnic conflicts, and but then now where U.S. government made a difference, well, we did win World War II. We ended the Holocaust. U.S. military units freed concentration camps at the end of the war. That's certainly true, but it's a mixed picture. The Dayton Peace Accords, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke brought an end to the conflict and violence in the Balkans in 1995. But again, the U.S. government was slow to react. And then I think we made a difference, stopped the killing with the military intervention, U.S. NATO in 1999. And I think they're also unknown. I mean, to be able to say, how do you prove or talk about a negative, something that didn't happen? Well, but I think through U.S. Agency for International Development Programs, U.S. Embassy engagement, empowerment of women in civil society, like going back to my first tour in Colombia. We had programs through USAID in the mid 1970s to empower women in society. I think those made a difference, but it's hard to we don't have statistics on that because the situation remained calm. I can mention some examples of that also in the Q&A. And then the political economic sustainability, when we helped countries develop and be able to provide economic prosperity, that removed a lot of the tension between groups, because a lot of times these ethnic tensions, killing, violence is about land or power, political power certainly, but about economic issues, access to water, and so on. So I want to recognize some of the diplomats that made a difference, and this is during the Roosevelt administration. Hiram Bingham, who was the U.S. Consul General in Marseille, France. He had instructions as a diplomat to only issue a very few visas to Jewish families. That he had a very strict quota. That was his instructions from Washington. He did not adhere to that. He issued a lot of, and this is one of them, he issued an immigrant visa to many thousands of Jewish families that saved lives. And he is now one of the righteous among nations. There's a plaque, and his name is at Yad Vashem, recognized as having done the right thing for the right reasons for a cause greater than self-saving Jewish lives. There were other diplomats in Budapest, Hungary, Raoul Wallenberg, and a Japanese diplomat who issued visas that saved Jewish lives. So now let's look at what we're dealing with today. I've talked about some of the genocide since World War II. Certainly Cambodia is not technically, among scholars and others, I see it more in terms of mass atrocities and crimes against humanity, but there's a definition I'll mention in a minute about genocide, but still a horrible tragedy in the mid 1970s. I mentioned Bosnia Kosovo, which is the Srebrenica, the massacre of 6,000 Muslim men and boys, certainly genocide has, and then Rwanda in 1994, that was a genocide. Darfur, Sudan, Secretary Powell had AID and others on the ground. That was a genocide in the President Bush administration. And then more recently, the persecution of the Yazidis by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, starting in 2014, was a genocide. And currently, China and the Uyghurs, that was designated genocide by Secretary Pompeo. Naomi Kikoler is going to talk about that later, so I'm not going to speak much about that. That's her topic, so you'll hear more in depth about that. And I am going to talk about the Rohingya, Afghanistan, and also Ethiopia. So Bosnia, Richard Holbrooke, Ambassador Chris Hill, colleague of mine from the Foreign Service, they're the ones that through diplomacy brought it into that war. And I tell my students, if you want to read about tough negotiations and successful negotiations, read Richard Holbrooke's book, To End a War, about negotiating the Dayton Accords. So 100,000 civilian casualties, 2 million internally displaced persons, and one of the most horrible events since the end of World War II. Today, it's still a fragile situation. This is Ambassador Robert Beecroft, who was the special envoy for the Bosnian Federation. And he wrote an article about, let's see, I think it was last year, 25th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords, and he's followed this situation still, and the State Department is still there, and the embassies and the political officers. It's still a very fragile situation between the ethnic groups, the politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There's little interest in working together, and so and actually one of the Serbian leaders, Dodik, has been sanctioned, economic sanctions by the government, U.S. government, because he is undermining the Dayton Peace Accords and the ability of these different groups to work together. So it's still very much something we need to watch, a work in progress. It's not over, the threat, the danger there. Rwanda genocide. I think you all know that we've had some excellent speakers last year, this year about the genocide, and over 100 days, this all unfolded very quickly. 800,000 Tutsis and others were murdered, and it was really it's one of those things where we're still working on accountability and reconciliation among the various groups. President Clinton met the survivors and the families of the victims 4 years later and apologized. He traveled to Rwanda, and this is what he said quite correctly, that he wanted to pay his respects, that we did not act quickly enough, and that we did not call these crimes by its rightful name, genocide. Samantha Power writes about this. She's in her book, A Problem from Hell. I recommend that to you because she details it in great detail where we've missed opportunities, U.S. government, and she puts forward ideas about going forward. The Education of Idealists, another one she wrote later after being U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and also in the National Security Council. Also, those are required readings for my students if they want to understand the U.S. government role and what we should be doing going forward in the future. So she's now head of USAID within the government, but she was the one who's written probably one of the best accounts, but there are other books about that. And so there is a reconciliation commission. President Paul Kagame is managing a process, but again, it's not over. It still needs to be managed and watched at the grassroots level with U.S. and other countries involved, not only the U.S., the French, the British, the United Nations. It's still a situation which we should be watching. Now I'd like to talk to you about another genocide, the Yazidi people in Iraq by the Islamic State. This unfolded as well very quickly and also in an area that was ungovernable almost. It started in 2014, and so the Yazidi men, because they were different, they were a different religious group in that area, they were executed if they didn't convert to Islam. The version that the Islamic State, which says women have no really role in society and so on, it's an aberration of the Muslim faith. And certainly I've talked to my Muslim friends in Afghanistan and today about that. And the women and girls were sold into slavery, and still they're Yazidis who are displaced and haven't been able to return home. And an estimated 2,800 women, children still captive in this ungoverned area. It's a very small minority, and they are in different countries in that area, an estimated 50 to 70,000 people, and a different religious faith. And they were persecuted, killed because they were different. Here's a map of the area, which again is this border between Syria, Iraq, where the Islamic State grew and spread. It's an ungoverned area, and it's still in many areas there's still pockets and towns that are controlled by the Islamic State, and there's concern today about a regrowth of that horrible group of people who perpetrated these crimes. This is Rosa Barkett, a young woman who was one of the victims of that tragedy of the genocide, and she was sold into slavery and still is dealing with others in families and communities, trying to reestablish their lives and deal with it. The Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2016 was Nadia Murad, and I would recommend to you her book. It tells in graphic detail about what she experienced, a horrible experience from watching her family, male family members, brothers and other male members of her small Yazidi community be murdered, slaughtered by the Islamic State. And then she was sold into slavery as well. Her book is titled The Last Girl, because she says, as an activist now today, she wants to be the last girl with a story like hers that and what she experienced. So as this was unfolding, the U.S. Consul General in Erbil was observing this, talking to the victims, the families of the victims. President Biden, President Obama was also aware of this, and Samantha Powers talks about this in her book, Education of an Idealist. This is Matthias Mittman, and he was very engaged with talking to the leaders of the Yazidi community, and also letting Congress and the U.S. administration know about what was happening. It was not just directed, this persecution against Yazidis, it was against Christians and other minorities. So as this unfolded, we, as the U.S. government, Matthias Mittman in their lead in a large consulate in Erbil, doing everything to provide human needs, shelter, food and clothing as this unfolded. Father Patrick Dubois talked about this in great detail earlier this week, and he's been there and talked to the victims, the women, and also families of those that were killed. And it was a very moving and somber presentation, but Father Dubois really put that in graphic terms for us earlier this week. So distribution of supplies, many of the Yazidis are women and others are now in the United States or in Europe or safe in other countries, but they want to go home. They want to reestablish their lives in their communities, but right now it's still a very fragile situation. There was just an attack by Islamic militants that came from this Islamic State. This was just a couple of weeks ago on a prison, and I think that was in northern Syria on the border. So they're still very active, and this needs to be watched very closely. So looking forward, Secretary Madeleine Albright and William Cohen, Democrat, Republican, came up with recommendations. This is because of Rwanda, because of our slow movement towards the problems of in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They came up with a task force and made 34 recommendations in their report in 2004. A lot of those have been implemented now today. So we have more of the tools to be able to prevent genocide, hopefully. And then I quoted here Alice Nadiratu, who's from Nigeria, and she's the UN Special Advisor to Secretary General Gutierrez. And she's been involved at the grassroots level, and she makes the point of how important it is to get women involved in atrocity prevention in the communities where, and that's been seen in Liberia and a number of countries, that women can have a very positive effect on building bridges across ethnic divides. So the current and the future, the genocide, this is the genocide definition. I think many of you already know this. It's a high bar. It's from the Genocide Convention in 1948. But whether an atrocity or a crime against humanity or a violation of human rights meets these criteria, the U.S. government is concerned, and we all should be, about what's going on, even though Cambodia may not be listed formally as a genocide, or it's still in Ethiopia today is called ethnic cleansing. It's certainly crimes against humanity and persecution but still, this is the definition. But the important quote here is, for going forward, from Yehuda Bauer, a Holocaust historian who I admire: don't be a victim, don't be a perpetrator, and don't remain silent. And that starts at the community level in the country where this is taking place. So the potential for mass atrocities, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Simon Scott Center, you'll hear more today from Naomi Kikoler, who is the director. And this is their list of countries at risk. And number one is Pakistan, then India, Yemen, Afghanistan is on the list, Ethiopia, and Myanmar. And that's probably, and you can look at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum website and see each country and the evaluation of the potential for mass atrocities that they do with a very sophisticated statistical model. I'm going to talk about Afghanistan because it's now number 4 on their list. And certainly my experience there was the Taliban, Haqqani network, and ISIL persecuted those, certainly the Hazara people who are Shia. They're not Sunni, they're a minority. Talk about them in a minute. Journalists, human rights advocates, LGBTQ plus people, or anyone who worked with the US government or other Western countries who had representatives there. Or so the Hazara people in Afghanistan, still today, they have an Asian look. They look different than the majority of the Afghan people. So that's what makes them vulnerable in a way to this persecution that continues. And they are descendants of Genghis Khan, Mongolian features, about 10% of the Afghan population, and Shia, which is a minority group in Afghanistan. When I was in Afghanistan, if there was a mosque blown up, it would have been a Shia mosque that Hazara people went to. And that's still, that continued until last year, and atrocities still are perpetrated now by the Taliban. And this is where the Hazara live, in Ghazni province in Afghanistan, but some are in Kabul, but primarily this is the area where they are. And there's a history here, sadly. In 1893, this king who massacred Hazara people. So it like anti-Semitism goes back centuries. The Hazara community has been dealing with this. And when I was in the Ministry of Counternarcotics, we had Hazara women who were interns in our ministry. The US government paid for them to go to the Asian University in Chittagong, Bangladesh, and they came back and interned with the anticipation they would work for the Afghan government. Very bright young women, and could have made a difference if they were able to be in government in Afghanistan. But now under the Taliban, since August, they are still at risk. The Hazara people, women, and there's been a recent brutal massacre last July. And we don't have as much good information on what's going on, but I'm hearing from other Hazara people and women who I can talk to, it's this continuing. Over 4,000 Hazaras were evicted by Islamic State, and that ethnic cleansing, as we call it, I'm sure is still continuing in Afghanistan. And I want to mention that Arizona State University, Tempe, Phoenix, and Arizona generally, I'm sure that's true of other universities, but I just want to pay attention and thank those in the ASU community who have received 64 Hazara women who were at that Asian university in Chittagong, Bangladesh, during the fall in August of last year. And so President Crow and a number of faculty and students have been very welcoming. They're now students at ASU, and they're invited to come and finish their education. They're also a group of 44 Hazara women who work for the Afghan military, work with the US military. They're in the United States. One of my former students is involved in helping them, and other students and other activists around the United States. And talking to them, their families are still at risk. They're hearing, and I have been able to interview and talk to them, they're hearing from their communities, their families are still at risk. And so there is a funding site if you want to get involved in this. They do need help to help support these women and men, Hazara men as well, but primarily women because of the Asian Women University group. Now I'll mention Ethiopia. This is a map of Ethiopia. You see the Tigray region in the north. And this is now seen as, and this has come up fast in just the last few years, as one of the most egregious humanitarian disasters in terms of health, the World Health Organization, and food and suffering by the Tigrayan people. And so there's a long history here. This was the Tigrayan prime minister. He lost power, and then the power changed to Abiy, who's now in charge. He actually won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 for resolving a border conflict with the Eritrea, and he certainly deserved. That was a good thing he did. But then he's slowly removed Tigrayans from government and started this persecution of the Tigrayan people. And the conflict, it's really a political conflict between the groups, but it's resulted in this humanitarian crisis. 9 million people in desperate need of food. Tigrayan rebels even. Now, there's not a lot of White House. There's atrocities on all sides here, from the Ethiopian government, Tigrayan rebels, and also Eritrea. But this is badly in need of stability. There is a glimmer of hope. March 24th, there was a unilateral truce declared by Prime Minister Abiy. The Tigrayan rebel forces said, we'll accept it, we'll let the food trucks come in. That did happen, I'm told. USAID and some other NGOs were able to get a food convoy in just last week. But this is not peace. This is just a ceasefire or a truce. Now, the work ahead with the U.S. Embassy involved and special negotiators, Senator Chris Coons was involved a year ago, is to bring peace to that country, hopefully. Myanmar, this is my other example. The Rohingya people, just a week or so ago, March 21st, Secretary Blinken was at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, talked very personally about his experience, his stepfather, who was a Holocaust survivor. And if you've not heard that, you should, because he's spoken at Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, at the U.S. Holocaust Museum about his deep personal reflections. But in this case, he was talking about the Rohingya people, labeling it a genocide. And this has real meaning and teeth in terms of economic sanctions. The Myanmar, this is Myanmar, and of course the Rakhine state is where the Rohingya people live. And then they are a minority, a Muslim group in a Buddhist country. And there are about 1 million of them. And this is where they fled. As you can see, there's almost 1 million in Bangladesh, 890,000, and they're at risk. These who have been able to go to other countries, they want to return home. And I've been told that those who are in Bangladesh just across the border, when this was announced about the genocide from Secretary Blinken, they thought maybe now we can go home. Well, no, it's not over. You still got people like this, a really nationalist, anti-Muslim Buddhist monk who has been labeled by Time Magazine face of Buddhist terror. He started some years ago with hate speech directed toward Rohingya people because they're different, because they're Islamic, not Buddhist. But and he is one of the causes of the situation today. Finally, I wanted to mention, I've mentioned some of the legislation from Congress. Congress has been very active in passing legislation to protect minorities. Most importantly, Global Fragility Act, also the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act. You can see those on the State Department website and the reports, and I recommend those to you. So just to remind you, coming full circle, the U.S. government, the commitment to human rights and atrocity prevention. It's a part of our foreign policy, and we have to keep centering ourselves on helping those minorities at risk. And I would point to you comments by Secretary of State Blinken to Congress very early on in the administration, March 10th, when he testified, of what we were doing to protect the rights of minorities, impose sanctions on the military coup leaders in Burma, and also in terms of conflict diplomacy. President Biden is vice president, and I testified before him as senator many years ago on what we were doing to combat anti-Semitism in Europe. He was very committed to fight against anti-Semitism. This was in 2003. And 2011, he mentioned, and this I think is his core belief, preventing genocide is an achievable goal. And he says it, Elie Wiesel says it, a number of people say it. But the US government, many times our efforts have come too late, like in Rwanda, and we've missed the least costly opportunities to bring peace and stability in conflict areas. We've missed them. So he's made a firm commitment. Now, I'd like to also mention to you the people and those that gave their lives in pursuit of human rights in different parts of the world. Deputy Assistant Robert Frazier died in a tragic accident, Mount Ingram, as he was a part of Richard Holbrooke's delegation, negotiating delegation, trying to bring peace to Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Balkan regions. And he died along with the Deputy Assistant Secretary Kurtzel from the Pentagon, Air Force Colonel. Also Ambassador Chris Stevens, who was an Arabist, knew Libya better than anyone in the U.S. State Department or most Western countries. And he died in Benghazi, mob that stormed into his residence, and he was trying to bring stability to that troubled country of Libya. And then when I was in Afghanistan, Foreign Service Officer Ann Smedinghoff, a public affairs officer, she had just met Secretary Kerry a couple of weeks previous. She was delivering school books to Afghan children when she was killed by a suicide bomber. So I do want to remember them and honor them, the people who tried to make a difference. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And thanks for your interest in this. I'd love to take questions, and maybe I can get some help from the floor since I can't see the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador O'Donnell. That was extremely informative, and I learned so much. And I think we have time for a few questions. So does anyone in the room have a question? Okay.
Thank you. Two quick questions. The first is, in your experience, what are the factors that prevent nation states from intervening more quickly when it's clear a genocide is occurring? And then the second is, do you see any hope of us developing something like a United Nations peacekeeping force that actually has teeth, that once certain criteria are met, that the international community would send in a peacekeeping mission that would actually enforce no-fly zones or stop the conflict until people come to the table?
Thank you. Those are both good, very, very good questions. And I think what limits our ability to recognize what's happening is the foreign service officers or the embassies that are there. Press play a very important role in reporting on what's happening in countries and NGOs. First of all, it's very important to verify information. So talking to the families of the victims and the survivors or victims themselves, or getting information and validating it. To be able to establish that genocide is taking place, there's a legal process that's involved. And that has to, for later prosecution, it's important to get that data. And sometimes that takes too long. And in the case of Darfur, Sudan, I think it was like 6 months from the beginning to end when Secretary Powell asked that it be verified what was happening, that it could be declared a genocide. The other thing is risks to U.S. diplomats. There are areas where we simply can't go. For example, we've not had a U.S. embassy present in Libya or Yemen for quite a while. And we've had to close different embassies in African countries where there's conflict, because I've mentioned the ambassador's first priority is protecting American lives. Well, that means diplomats as well. So in Afghanistan, for example, there were a lot of areas U.S. embassy diplomats could not go into that were controlled by the Taliban. So we had to rely on what we were hearing from others, Afghan people who supported our hopes for democracy and representative government, who would tell us what's going on in our region. So and I think the objective is to be able to have the tools to move more quickly, use technology, social media, so we can recognize what's going on. And then there sometimes has been a gap between knowing what to do and taking action, and that needs to be closed too. A UN force, I think in terms of the military, the blue helmets, they have made a difference in many countries around the world, but clearly they need, it needs to be improved. It requires the member states of the United Nations to make that commitment, and also the coordination of that. So it's a work in progress. And I think the UN blue helmets have stabilized a lot of places around the world where we haven't heard about because they're stable. But other areas, like in Rwanda, there has, when the United Nations with US support pulled out that UN force, which could have made a difference in stabilizing the tragedy going on there.
There's several questions on the online Q&A, so I'll start with Bastions. In light of recent discoveries in Bucha, Russian deportations and filtration camps, as well as admissions on Russian state media of de-Ukrainization, what steps should or must the United States take to prevent the further genocide of the Ukrainian people?
Okay, thank you, Bastian, for that question. And Bastian's a former student of mine, and he's gone on to do some great things, and he's in the Phoenix area. So thank you. There is a process now. Ambassador Clint Williamson and others are in Poland interviewing refugees to get testimony. And also you've heard President Biden speak out about war crimes, Secretary Blinken. That's important. And then President Zelensky speaking to the Security Council and to the U.S. Congress and to other groups around the world to call attention to this. The issue here, it's a tragedy as we watch this unfold, and it's just watching the news, and hopefully that we could somehow let the Russian military know, certainly Putin, but the Russian military, that there's going to be accountability, that it's a long process, sometimes more than we want, but Milosevic and Mladic were brought to justice in a special tribunal. Charles Taylor was brought to justice in a special Sierra Leone tribunal. And those Russian military leaders, even at the captain and major level, and the soldiers, I mean, to me, I would hope, I was in the U.S. Army, and there's something called psychological operations where you drop leaflets behind enemy lines. Well, there, if we could reach those soldiers and say, what you're doing is, there's going to be accountability. So think about that accountability and stop this persecution of the Ukrainian people. That's my own, I have no inside knowledge. I'm not with the government, but that's the way I would see it.
Okay, the next one from the Q&A is from Mark. What do you consider to be the fault lines in India, Pakistan that could lead to genocide recurring in that area?
Well, it's about, and this is, as you know, an old issue, goes back, and now we have a nationalist government and in India, and it's in several areas. If you read that report of the Simon Coates Center of Early Warning, and that's why India is number 2 on their list, but it's an old conflict between two groups. And in this case, many cases in India, it's directed against the Muslim minorities, and it's about land, it's about power, it's about the history of the tragedies where parents, grandparents suffered, either Muslims or Hindus or other faiths or minorities in the country. So there we need, starts at the grassroots level and the responsibility of the government to begin with, and the communities. But then to the extent that the US government or UN or other governments can be supportive and helpful, certainly the US would stand for human rights and treating each other with respect and stopping the persecution and the killing. Okay.
Are there any other questions in the room? There are a couple more in the chat. Okay. One of these is quite similar to the one that was just asked in Ukraine. So I think I'm going to well, maybe I'll focus on the second part of it. It says it's about sort of violence in Ukraine and declaring it genocide. How is genocidal intent proven? And how can the process of recognizing genocide be hastened in order to try and stop it?
Okay, the issue in Ukraine is war crimes. So the U.S. administration is developing evidence and factual information to demonstrate that there are war crimes occurring. And also the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ICC, has said that he has opened up a case as well. And the Ukrainian government's collecting information, but the issue there is war crimes. Now, genocide there are 5 criteria. And so one is killing members of the group. Second, causing bodily or mental harm, conditions of life, physical destruction in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent births and transferring children. Well, those criteria have been met, certainly beginning with the Holocaust in World War II, but also in Rwanda. But the issue for Ukraine today is first and foremost the war crimes that are occurring. So that's what's on the table.
This is Jason. I'm just as maybe a follow-up to that. Could you maybe speak to in one of your last slides, you had several sort of recent pieces of legislation about genocide and mass atrocity. Could you speak to how those could contribute in specific ways to helping, say, the United States government broadly or the State Department to identify and act in instances of genocide? What are the contributions that they make that weren't there in the past?
Okay, well, first of all, the Global Fragility Act, that helps the Conflict Stabilization Bureau and others stop the hatred and bring stability to communities upstream before we get to the killing and where we're already into a conflict situation. And that requires a report to Congress and has funding with it that allows for training, but that's the Global Fragility Act. The other one that I think goes directly to this issue is the Elie Wiesel Act for preventing atrocities and genocide. That also provides funding and authority for the administration to work on country by country, a report to Congress about what's the situation and going on now. And it also calls for more training for foreign service officers who are out there in conflict areas, so they recognize the indicators of hatred, bigotry, hate speech from that, for example, that Buddhist monk I showed you that spoke hate speech against the Rohingya people in Burma, the upstream end of trying to stop that march towards persecution, ethnic cleansing, atrocities, and ultimately genocide before it happens. And it starts, going back to my experience in the Holocaust, it starts with words, hate speech. It starts, and sadly, we see that still today in terms of anti-Semitism in the United States and Europe. It starts with speech, and then the other, and then persecution, and then violence. But I think each of these pieces of legislation are to empower the government, the State Department to hopefully be able to take quicker action. I mean, there's a lot going on in this world, and one of the reasons that I think we were slow in Rwanda to take advantage is the focus of Washington was on Serbian, the Balkan Serbian perpetrators in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also the conflict between Croatia and Serbia. So the more people we have out watching, the more engaged we are with both diplomats, but also NGOs and the Western press, the better. So that's the purpose of a lot of this legislation and intent of Congress, as I understand it.
Thank you. And one final question from the Q&A. What are your top 5 resources for news and current updates about these kinds of issues?
That's a good question. Thank you. And you may know some that I don't, so I'm always willing and open. I think the Simon Coates Center for Preventing Atrocities and Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is certainly one indicator. But others are Human Rights First, Amnesty International, the United Nations, the Office of the that was empowered with that. I've mentioned the special envoy for preventing atrocities, genocide, Alison Nerdurtu, and Michelle Bachelet, this former president of Chile, and her role. So there are various sources. I think American University has a reporting site as well in Washington, D.C. So there's a number of academic institutions that partnered with NGOs, and I would look to them. But the one I guess there's also the State Department website, and you can get access to a lot of the information. Like there was an April 1st announcement of countries at risk, and this Conflict Stabilization Office has got a 10-year plan for countries like Mozambique and others that they listed in that press announcement that's on the State Department website. That was an April 1st announcement, and you could look at that. That's can be very informative.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for your interest.
Well, thank you
Appreciate
so much for speaking with us today. I know I really enjoyed hearing what you were saying. I learned so much, and appreciate your time in coming here.
Thank you. My
Thank you.
pleasure. Bye-bye. Thank you.